Hello and welcome to the Seek His Kingdom podcast. My name's Daniel.
And I'm Andre. Today our recording setup is a little bit interesting because we're actually many
We're not
miles
together.
apart.
Yes, a couple thousand miles apart. Actually, more than just a couple thousand. In fact,
So
we're working on
still back
completely
home in the
different times
US.
right now.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm in Ukraine right now. It's 8:30 in the morning right now here.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it's 10:30 at night.
Nice. Yeah, so
We'll apologize in advance for maybe the conversation might be a little rough because of that.
yeah, it might be more delayed than you expected. But what are we trying to talk about today?
So I think
ahead.
we've even touched on this topic a little bit before, but just this idea of we touched on it in the last episode where we talked about the church, but the idea of traditions and conserving different things, like the way we used to do things, and how a lot of, as Daniel we were talking before we started recording, how a lot of things right now are under question. And maybe Daniel could go into some examples.
Yeah. So it's interesting that over this period of time that we've been kind of living in, a lot of traditions have been questioned. So people have really, like, at least in our tradition, people have stood up for a specific thing. Like there's churches that say we will not have the worship style of church. You know, we're not going to have
like a praise band.
We're not going to do worship. We're not going to have a worship group. We're just going to have a choir, and that's it. And it seems like over the past few months, things like this have gone under a question mark, when you can't really do choir like you used to do, and you can't really do church the way you used to do. And so it interests me that we often, as people, will stand up just extremely strong, like we'll have like an extremely strong stance against something or for something, to the point that we'll just fight for it, tooth and nail, understanding that, like, this is not doctrine, this is not something that is set in stone, something that God didn't say that we are absolutely required to do this. And then we'll stand up for it.
It's not necessarily biblically defined.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. Oftentimes these things aren't biblically defined. We might have a biblical reason to having the tradition that we have, but at the end of the day, it's just a tradition, or even just a desire, something we want. And people often just stand up for what they want, to the point where they're willing to break relationships for what they want, for some sort of tradition or something that they really, really, really desire. And yeah, go ahead.
I mentioned this a little bit last time, but this could go both ways, not just in terms of old traditions that maybe our parents or whoever have, but this could also go in the way of new traditions, stuff that people are making up and getting creative, maybe not always in the correct direction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people often do this. They do this thing where we want to break from tradition. We want to do something new, and their whole tradition of the church is that we don't have traditions. And so what that means is we're always progressing. Well, that's also a tradition. Like, progress.
You progress to something.
Yeah, exactly. Progress also it's also a tradition. Like, not allowing for something to be ever set in stone in your church is also, or like where things are constantly changing. You're always having the new music, never sing the old music, right? That's a tradition, but it's just different. It's the other side of the coin. I think there's a lot of dangers, though, in the fact that we lift up our own desires and things that we feel are right to a very high point. Like we lift them up to the point where we don't count other people's positions, and it results in some pretty bad splits in churches and stuff like that.
Yeah, and let me. So, kind of the popular definition of tradition is I'm just reading off of Google right now from Oxford Dictionary. The transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on in this way. So that's just kind of the regular definition of tradition. And the thing is, in theology, if you're googling this word, you could see the second definition of it. In theology, is a doctrine believed to have divine authority, though not in the scriptures. So, like it doesn't have to be something that's from the past and passed down. Like in theology, your tradition is just something that you're maybe elevating to or close to scripture, which is wrong.
Exactly. The thing is, this thing goes down all the way to the core of relationships. Like it's one thing that it happens in the church at large, but it also happens in relationships on smaller levels. So people will stand up for their own desires. I've found that there's a definition of oftentimes people usually fall into one of two categories of people. There's people that I would call, well, this is kind of transliterated from Ukrainian because this word is often used in Ukrainian. There's a category of people that I call principled people. And then there's the other side of the coin, or people that are more relational. So there's people who will stand up for their principle. And then there's the other side of people who will stand up for a relationship. So this is kind of that. It's the whole. It's that whole kind of argument between like truth and love. It's very similar to that. So somebody who is principled will usually stand up for the truth very hard, and then the person that is more relational will stand up for love really hard. Like they will go to any extent to make sure that the relationship is saved. And that means that they will sacrifice all of their desires, they will sacrifice anything, to the point where oftentimes people that are relational, they will sacrifice even their high core principles for the sake of unity or peace or something like that. Yeah. So I think that's something that's worth to have a conversation about.
Where would you say you find yourself?
I find myself typically on the relationship side of the scale. That's me personally. I'm the type that I'm the type. Well, I stand up. I try to stand up for truth as much as possible. But if you ever find me in a conversation with somebody, like I don't like people being hurt or anything like that, and so I'll often be the type where I'm just like, well, maybe you should, maybe we should be nicer to people. Maybe we should consider their opinion, even though the person might be completely wrong. It's a fault of mine as well that I've found in myself, because this requires me to be more active about standing up for my own principles. This might be kind of the reason why I do things like this, and it might be interesting because I preach. So you would think, oh, this guy stands up for the truth all the time, just as hard as possible. Well, not really. I'm ready to have a conversation, but, I think there's a side of me that also kind of has an issue with that, where I try to be so nice to people sometimes that I'm a little too nice.
Mm-hmm. Well,
if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. I think it's still good to have that balance, because the thing is, there's lots of people who will do a lot of standing up, but without any how do you put it, like without actually achieving anything. Basically, if you're not going to change the person's mind with if you want to change someone's mind, and the method you're going to use to do it is not going to work, then why kind of push it, I guess. And that's kind of where I find myself. It's like if I'm not gonna if somebody says something in a conversation that's just kind of like off, maybe I'm not gonna just like, oh, pause there, that's heresy, and like, go into some crazy thing. But if there is a moment where I think that I can actually teach something, or maybe actually build someone up, then like I'll go for it. If I have that influence with that person, yeah.
Yeah, but that means like, that's like, for me usually that's like the toughest thing for me is disagreement. And, like, harsh disagreement, where I'm walking into this room and there's going to be an argument right now, and people's feelings may be hurt, and people may leave not feeling great about themselves, like words might go flying and emotions might be high. And that's the moment when I'm usually like, you know what, I will sacrifice my own position for the sake of peace. And the problem is, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. Because on the other side, there's people that are principled. And those people will take any opportunity that they get to have their position met, or like their desires met. And what they will do is they will usually say, the moment you say, we'll just, if I sacrifice my position and I say, okay, I don't really particularly care how this works, I don't have a particular opinion or tradition about this, that person automatically jumps on and says, we're going to do it this way. This is the way we should do it. This is the way we need to do it. And it goes from this is the way we should do it to this is the way we need to do it really quickly. And that's when you start to have issues. You start to feel the tension, and then somebody else comes in that might also be principled and say, no, this isn't the way we need to do it. We need to do it this way. And it's like, well, guys, well, maybe we don't need to, be so uptight about our own positions. Maybe we need to be a little bit looser. And truth be told, that's probably true.
Yeah, maybe the answer is none of the above.
Yeah, but maybe it is none of the above. Maybe it needs to be a balance for both people. I think we need a level of principle and a level of like relational, a relational side to ourselves as well.
Yeah, and to kind of maybe more solidify, this is very abstract, but like, let's go back to, I don't know, choir versus band.
Right.
It's not like in the Bible, it's like, oh, you need to have 50 choir members on stage. And like, technically, and this is where the Presbyterians would be like, well, you shouldn't have either, or something like that. But like the point is that neither of those are necessarily like set in stone things. So maybe it's okay to...
Yeah, maybe it's okay to... Yeah, but the problem is that I think people often, they create for themselves... Now look, this is true on both sides. The principled people just seem to have this more often than the relational people. They seem to have it. It's more glaring, is where people seem to have this tradition that we're talking about that is not biblical. They just have this tradition, and for them, it's set in stone. It's at the level of God. Like, this thing never changes. It's like the Bible for them. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit, sealed, and this is the way it needs to be. And a lot of people think this way. And
in a sense, it's like not... Well, never mind.
So I think again, like I said, it's for both people. Like both sides have an issue with this, where they have this tradition that is often higher than the principles themselves. Like I think there's a lot of people that I think I have this issue sometimes too, where they hold up peace to such a high degree that they're like, if there's any confrontation, if there's any moment where someone gets angry at someone, like absolutely not. This is the worst possible thing that can happen. Like we need to have peace at any cost, and any disagreement is considered just terrible. Well, it's just like, well, that's not really the way it works. You know, disagreement is not a bad thing. There was disagreement in the Bible. Paul disagreed with Barnabas, and they split, and they had a split. Like they both went their own ways. It's not a bad thing. Like
I think it like depends on what kind of, is it disagreement? Is it just simple disagreement, or is it division?
yeah, for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's division, and that's bad. And I think like you also have to see like what results it can bring about. You always need to be ready to sacrifice your own position, but also you can't sacrifice. I've also realized that you can sacrifice to the point where if you don't, if how do I put this correctly?
Where basically nobody, I guess nobody's learning anything, or
There's moments where, if I think this is why I think executive leadership or some sort of leadership is always required, because if you start to do things in a sort of democratic way, it gets to a point where you get two sides and it's a stalemate. You can't do anything about it. And there needs to be somebody who is balanced, who can take both positions, some sort of mediator who can look at both positions and can help with the situation, kind of figure things out. But these are kind of, these are more minor details. I think in the church more often, the leadership is there, but even there's often disagreement with the leadership on the way that they need to do things. And again, like I said, disagreement is not a bad thing, but I think it also depends on what the result is. Like what does the result lead to? And I think that's the biggest problem, is that we never look at what's going to happen at the end.
Yeah. And to kind of go into like you mentioned a few times, like what's the result? Well, like let's read in First Timothy chapter 6. It says that basically to avoid people that, and I'll read from verse 4. It says, he is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. So it's kind of like, what are the result? Like, is the result of your I guess disagreement, is it division and for people going further to depravity and going into slander and all this just like evil stuff, or are people learning from this disagreement and maybe being built up and being corrected and going onto the right path? Because we can't always just keep going like the same way we've always had. Because sometimes there are things that we need to change, and sometimes people do need to bring up disagreements.
Going right off of what you said, I just was looking at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14, where it says, remind them of these things and charge them before God, not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. And you realize that there are things that have a negative effect even on the spread of the gospel. If you stand up, if you have little battles about worthless things, the result is extremely negative. You don't lift up the gospel. You don't bring more people to Christ. You actually bring the gospel into disrepute. And this is what a lot of people actually start to see in Christianity. Well, this Christianity is just a bunch of disagreement. There's a bunch of people who can't agree on a bunch of things. Well, when we start to peddle about little miniature things, that's what it is. I mean, yes, when we are talking about the Bible, there are closed hand things, as they call them. There are things that it's just absolute truth. We can't bow down. So all those people who sacrificed their lives, the martyrs, the people who were persecuted, they were persecuted not for opinion. Well, not all of them. There's a lot of them that had their opinions, but most of them, they stood up for absolute truth. They stood up for Jesus Christ. They stood up for the gospel. They stood up for they stood up for things that Jesus is Lord. That's what they stood up for, and that's what they were killed for, because of these absolute truths.
Yeah.
A lot of us seem to be dying on hills that aren't absolute truth.
Have you ever heard of, there's this term called bike shedding?
Bike shedding?
Bike shedding. So I'll tell this metaphor. I'll say it in my own words, but you can look it up. Kind of that there's an idea where, like, let's say somebody gathered a committee, and they were discussing a nuclear power plant, and as they were going through all the details of the nuclear power plant, like all the control panels, all this stuff, people didn't really have anything to say, and they were just quiet. But then towards the end of the meeting, they brought up a bike shed next to that was going to be built next to the power plant, and when they asked what color it should be painted, all of a sudden everybody had something to say, and the meeting just absolutely erupted. Like, and the moral of it is that, like, on the important stuff, and maybe in the church this applies, like, people honestly don't even know much about it, just like the committee didn't really know how nuclear power plants work, so they didn't say anything. So the important stuff we kind of glaze over because we just don't care or learn about it. And then you get all these churches teaching all kinds of crazy, like, nonsense. But then the little stuff, like the style of music or the color of the lights on the stage, or the style of wood decoration in the hall, everybody has an opinion on that, and because that stuff is the easy stuff, but it's really meaningless.
Definitely. Oh my goodness, definitely. It's I see what you're talking about here, and this makes complete sense. It makes complete sense. The important stuff nobody pays attention to, but when it comes down to something that's tiny and honestly just a useless detail, all of a sudden, for people, it's life and death. Why are these the hills that we die on? Why do we die on these? This could be coming from my relational side, being a person that's very relational, but I also understand that I need to be, I've lived my life up until now trying to be as balanced as I can be. At least when I realized what kind of person I am, when I realized, oh, okay, I kind of, this is where I tend to struggle with. I've started my best to be strong on the things that I believe are absolute, and then the things that are just traditions that could be changed, traditions that might not have a future. I'm open-handed on them, because Well, because it's just it's pointless for us to fight over things that have no longevity. They're going to be gone in the future anyway. Things that, you know, again, these short-term, small little things that in the future they aren't going to have a massive effect on us. And we tend to fight over these small little things rather than the eternal and the big and the important things. And that's why you see the church right now. The church doesn't know how to answer the culture. The culture has big, big questions right now to it. But rather than answering the questions of the culture, the church knows, well, this is how I should be dressing to church.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is, church is this way for me. Some weird little things that people have made up, some sort of traditions, rather than seeing the big picture things, because there are principles that we need to be standing up for. And it's extremely important for us to be standing up for these questions. But I think the devil blinds us. Would you hold me up on that? The devil blinds us with these small little things so that we don't notice the bigger picture.
Yeah, and he distracts us.
Definitely. I think we get easily pulled into these little questions that are often just useless, that we don't need to be focusing on as in such detail.
Yeah. What are some ways that we can, I don't know, improve, and what are some positive things we can do to improve in this? I'll say that like right away that probably the biggest thing is to learn what is actually important, so that you are not like once you know what's important, like the gospel, the who God is, all that stuff. Like once you're actually focused on that, then these little things, these meaningless things, you kind of leave them behind just because you have something bigger to worry about. And I think that's one thing I would encourage anybody, just to get more into the Bible, more into studying, just to make sure that you are actually focusing on what is important.
I think that's also a very good point.
Yeah, so you are focusing on what God cares about in His Word rather than what Christian culture cares about today.
Yeah, don't be the warrior for the traditions that you grew up with. Don't be the warrior of don't be the warrior of your own, how do I put it correctly, your own life, or no, not your own life, the warrior of your own
experience,
your own desires, or the things that you are comfortable with. Be a warrior of God's will, not the will that you have been, I don't know, maybe your culture has instructed you is correct. Because your culture will instruct, like, okay, right now, a lot of churches have gone the woke direction. Because, well, that's the tradition of the day. And people have become so overcome with wokeness that they don't really see anything else in this world. They don't pay attention to God's law, to God's will. It's the will of the world, but it's not God's law. It's not God's will. And I think a lot of us are this way too, that we're just like, we'll stand up for these little peddly things that we have, that we've grown up with, understanding that they're true, and we won't see God's truth, and we won't stand up for it. Well, mostly because we don't know it. We don't know it enough to care about it. And when you don't know the Bible, when you don't know the Word of God enough to actually care about it, that's what happens. You start to stand up for choir over worship group. You start to stand up for suits and ties, for some specific amount of length for the church service. amount of preachers you have, all these different things. And rather than thinking about, okay, how can this practically improve our preaching of the gospel, instead you think, well, this is the way we've done it all the time. I also think another side to it is always question your. I know this might sound bad for some people, but always question your traditions. Like, bring your traditions to the altar of the Bible, and be ready to have them changed. Be ready to sacrifice them.
And I think that's an important thing to clarify. It's we question in light of what God has said in His Word. We don't question in light of what I want or what I think, but rather what God thinks of this.
Exactly. Yeah. Always question. Question the things that you believe in, and the things that you keep doing all the time, based on what God wants from you.
Yeah, compare them to God's Word.
There are things. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All the things that you do, if you find a reason for them to be done in the Bible, all power to you. But if you keep finding that the Bible kind of is, eroding at something that you keep doing regularly, it's time to change that tradition, probably. Especially if it's something that continues to bring a sort of quarrel into your life. How do you think do we? Okay, another way that actually often happens that our traditions are kind of are changed is by God. I mean, we can't really control this. God will often put us into a situation like this current time that we're living in, where all of our traditions start to get questioned. And that's when we kind of have no other choice other than to start to sacrifice our traditions if we want to continue to do God's law. And that's when God starts to show us, hey, these things that you used to do, I mean, they're not bad, but right now, this is what's required of you. I think that's kind of like the story of Peter, where Peter was laying, when Peter was sleeping, and all of a sudden he sees the vision of the birds coming down, or all the different unclean animals actually coming down, and God says to him, "Take and eat." And for Peter, that was a massive tradition. Absolutely not, Lord. How can I do this? I've never done this. And God said, God was saying, your tradition, yeah, it's well and good. I was the one that instructed you to do this. But right now, you need to change it for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom, for its growth. Another thing is, we need to find out ways to be better at resolving conflict resolution, because we are, I think we as humans, we all suck at it. We're pretty terrible at it, and we actually got to figure something out. Like, how in the world do we come to decisions? What do you think is a good way for people? Because like I've been thinking about this, especially recently. Like, how do we resolve conflict? I understand compromise. There's things that we need to compromise, but there's also things that we can't compromise on, right? Like, there's kind of two sides to this. We need to, how do we resolve conflict?
Yeah, I'll say kind of the very first thing is what is your motive, I guess? Like, do you genuinely care about the people that are in disagreement with you? Do you genuinely love them? Are you trying to build them up, or are you trying to be above them and be correct, if that makes sense? Because then you're gonna, because that's gonna give you a very different tone to your approach and method to your approach.
Oh yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. From the motive part, I think the one hard question for me is like, it's understandable, like when two sides are able to resolve conflict and compromise from their own, each from their own side. It's much easier. But what if, what if one side is just, extremely headstrong about their own position? While you're willing to, to step out for them on their end, what if somebody's the type that they just continue to take to take advantage of you? At what point do you say it's about time to stop, or do we not do that? Because if we look at the Bible, we see where Jesus says, "Is it not better for you to be what's the exact words? I don't remember right now. For you to be misused, or for you to be, for your rights to be violated, so to speak."
I don't know exactly where you're talking about, but that is kind of like a theme. It's not really about us. It's not about us getting our way.
Is it not better is it not better to be wronged? Oh no, hold on. I'm quoting Jesus when I should be quoting Paul, where people are bringing lawsuits against each other in the church of Corinth. And First Corinthians chapter 6, and in chapter 6 verse 5, he says, "I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers, but brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers? To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded?"
Yeah,
but you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers.
Yeah, and this shows back to what we were talking about when our disagreements are damaging to the gospel.
Yeah, exactly. Man, I think we need to. I think we always need to keep this. We need to make this a conscious thing in ourselves. What am I disagreeing about? Like, because look, disagreements are like an every single day thing. Every single day you disagree with somebody, and I think we really need to ask ourselves this question: like, what are we really disagreeing over? Like, is it worth it? What are we even talking about here, so to speak? Like, are we ready to become like just militant about some sort of position? How headstrong are we going to be over something? Is it worth it? What's the result? Who's going to win at the end? Is the name of God going to be glorified? I think that's the biggest question at the end. Will God be glorified through this? Will His will be done? And what are we achieving?
Yep. Because if you're going into a disagreement with the goal of you being right and you, I guess, getting the glory, it's going to be it's going to reflect in how you do and what the end result is.
Oh, definitely. You see this I think you see this in relationships and in marriages. I've heard this many times, and I think it's a true statement that in marriage there is no winner. Like in a marriage argument, there is no winner. Okay, you were right. Congratulations. Now what?
Yeah.
Like, you might have destroyed your whole family for that, for you being right, or you getting your own way, for you winning. How much will you really enjoy winning? How much will you really enjoy winning? Like, I speak from that relational side of myself, because this is the way that I think about these things. And when I think about these sort of situations, I can't, like, when you get into an argument with somebody that's really close to you, when you get into into disagreement. I think you should definitely see, will our relationship grow after this? Or will this have destroyed everything that we have been fighting for so much time in our lives, because of something that I decided was considered so important for me? But then again, there is the other side where if it's as important as Jesus Christ and his lordship and serving him with your entire life, well, Jesus was the one that says that, follow me. To follow me, you need to leave your mother and father and brother and sister, and he says that anyone who has left family to be with me, he will receive hundredfold in the kingdom, right? I think that's what those were the words that he said. So for the gospel, there's relationships that are worth breaking for the gospel. But when it has to do with something small, how important is it?
Yeah. And here's an interesting thought on just kind of thinking still about the idea of lawsuits, what Paul's talking about here, and how Christians should do this stuff. And this is going to be maybe an interesting thought. This is a me being tired thought, one of those. So the way the world claims that there is no absolute truth, but then with the way that the world handles disagreements, they sure act like their truth is the absolute truth. While on the other hand, Christians need to know that there is an absolute truth, and that God knows, holds, and defines that absolute truth, while we also have the humility to kind of say that we're not the ones that hold that truth, that it's God. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense?
Yes, that makes so much sense. That's a really good point. It's not right because I said it. It's not truth because I said it or because I believe it. It's truth because God believes it. That's why it's so important.
And not that. Well, I don't know how to accurately word something like that. Like, it's not that God believes it or defines it, or I don't know. I was having a discussion.
Because it's the truth according to God.
Yeah,
I guess, so to speak.
I was actually having a discussion on just with some people on like apologetics and that kind of stuff, and this is a whole another topic, but just the idea of is God held to morals? Does God define morals, or does God is he just the definition himself of morality? But that's another topic. But I think here it's
another topic we could think about.
Yeah, here I think it's kind of like we know that God is the truth, that we're imperfect humans, we might not always understand it, which is why our disagreements can be very silly.
Oh man, definitely. Sometimes you think about it, you look at some people and you're like, man, really? You're going to fight for all of that? Is it really that important?
And like, even looking back at myself, some of the hills I tried to die on, like...
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I think it had to do more with pride than the hill I had to die on.
For sure.
Something about being right. Yeah, definitely. Anyway, I hope that we could have been an encouragement or a help for our listeners today. It's nice to catch up with you, and I hope everyone's actually doing pretty well over at home.
Yeah, I mean, we have Kanye West running for president now, so it's interesting times.
Oh man, don't we live in the strangest times? Well,
Dude, it's like every day. It's like, what is, what's next?
definitely. All right. Well, thank you
Yep,
for joining us today.
yep,
For
and
we-
hopefully the
at the
audio
Seek His
quality will
Kingdom
be decent.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully, we were an encouragement, and however the audio ended up turning out, hopefully it wasn't too annoying.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear what we're saying, and I think that's good.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, exactly. So, hope the Lord is blessing you and keeping you, and
Mm-hmm.
continues to shine His face upon you, and
Mm-hmm.
gives you peace. And
Mm-hmm.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We are done.